There are basically two ways to send images from Lightroom into Photoshop. You can either use Lightroom's external editing link or create an export preset. Both methods have their advantages and disadvantages. In this video, we'll see how to send images to Photoshop using Lightroom's external editing link. The workflow for this method is straightforward. You right-click or option-click on an image or a group of selected images in Lightroom and select Edit in Adobe Photoshop CC. Now, if you're in the grid view, be sure to click either right there on the image itself or a little bit to the edge. If you click, let's say up here, you won't get the contextual menu that has the Edit in that you need. Also, if your image is offline, and even if it has a smart preview associated with it, the Edit in options are not available. They're grayed out. If Photoshop's Camera Raw and Lightroom are in sync, you'll go straight to the Photoshop CC workspace. If they're not in sync, you'll get a warning that there may be compatibility issues, but you can still choose to open your image anyway. Exactly how the image or images are opened in Photoshop is determined by Lightroom's external editing preferences. I'm going to go back over to Lightroom here. You'll find these preferences by choosing Lightroom Preferences on a Mac or Edit Preferences on a PC, and then selecting the External Editing tab. If Photoshop CC is on your hard drive, it will automatically show up as the default editor with several options. You can also choose another editor or the same editor with different option choices down here. I'll show you why this might be appropriate in a minute. The first choice you have is file format. There are only two choices, TIFF or PSD. By default, TIFF is selected, and that's because there are fewer things that can go wrong with this choice. If you choose PSD, you'll need to make sure that in Photoshop you've selected Maximize Compatibility when you save in Photoshop. You also have three choices for color space: ProPhoto RGB, Adobe RGB 1998, and sRGB. ProPhoto RGB is a very large color space and therefore compatible with the Lightroom color space. It's your best option when you want to preserve color details from Lightroom. Keep in mind, however, ProPhoto RGB is not supported by many applications outside of Photoshop and Lightroom. When you export your final image from Lightroom, you probably will either choose the Adobe RGB or sRGB color spaces. Under bit depth, you can choose either 8 bits component or 16 bits component. I recommend 16 bits component when you want to preserve color details, although it doubles the file size. Resolution is set to 240 by default. You can type in a number between 72 and 600. This only determines viewing resolution. It has nothing to do with image size. No reason to change the default setting. Under compression, you can choose from None to LZW to Zip. None will result in a larger file size, while LZW and Zip will apply lossless compression for a smaller file size. Compressed files take a little longer to open, but other than that, there's no trade-off in quality. Okay, so now you've set your preferences for CC. You can also set preferences for an additional external editor, such as iPhoto or Photoshop Elements. Frankly, since I'm assuming you all have Photoshop CC as part of the Photoshop photography program, you might consider using the preset menu as a way to establish an alternative set of preferences that will also apply to CC. For example, let's just say you know your final output of your work is a monitor, and color requirements are less critical. In order to speed up your workflow, and ultimately to end up with a smaller file size, you could set your color space to sRGB and select 8 bits. You could also apply some lossless compression to make the file size even smaller. Once you've set these parameters, now go over here to Choose and navigate to the Adobe Photoshop CC application. Now I'm going to select choose, and it's going to prompt me saying that I've already chosen CC as an editor application. Now I'm going to go ahead and use this anyway because I've set the parameters different. So I'll select use anyway. Now I want to give this preset a name, so I'm going to select preset and then save current settings as new preset. So I'm going to give this a descriptive name. Let's just go Photoshop CC, and since it's sRGB, it's 8 bits, that should be enough. That's descriptive enough. And I'm going to hit create. So once I've done that, I'm finished with my, my settings. I'm going to come back to these preferences in a second, but let me go back over to my grid view in library module. I'm going to right click on this image, and you can see now that that preset will appear here as an alternative to my original edit in Adobe Photoshop CC. So let's go back over to the preferences. We're not finished there. And after we're done creating the second preset, we have the choice of stacking with original. If you just leave it checked, the edited copy of the file will be stacked in Lightroom along with the original file. I think this is a good idea, so just keep it checked. Finally, you can also apply a new file name to the edited version down here. By default, your edited file will return from Photoshop with the original file name plus the word edited, and then the appropriate file extension, either PSD or TIFF. To avoid confusion with Lightroom edits, you might use the word PS edited instead. It's up to you. To change the file name, choose Edit, and in the File Name Templates editor, type in the word you want. So once you've set your preferences, go ahead and close that window. Now, if Photoshop is open, the process of bringing an image or images from Lightroom into Photoshop will happen quickly. The exact amount of time will, of course, depend on the resolution of the image and or the amount of images selected. Unless you've selected Open as Smart Object, Lightroom is essentially rendering a TIFF or PSD version of your images or image using the parameters you set in the Lightroom preferences. If you've selected Open as Smart Object in Photoshop, Lightroom is both rendering and embedding the original raw file into your image when it opens in Photoshop. Okay, you've seen how using Lightroom's built-in link between itself and Photoshop is a straightforward, easy way to get your images into Photoshop. Just keep in mind when you go to Photoshop this way, you have no control over file size. And this can make a huge difference if you're working with very large files or if you want to composite several of them at once. Next, we'll look at another viable way to bring images into Photoshop that gives you more flexibility and control.